Excellent. I'll just do a quick intro of myself. My name's Amber. I work with CAF now as a contractor, but formerly as a full-time wildfire resilience specialist before I moved to Oregon, but happy to still be working on some projects with them. And this one was pretty unique. I touched a lot of different farmer folks and listened to a lot of different stories and experiences to be able to put together, with help from the National Farmers Union and the Local Food Safety Collaborative, a booklet on wildfire and food safety. And that was not really a topic that too many people were talking about. So when we started digging into it, we found a lot of weird things, and there was enough content there that we decided we needed to do something about it and share that information. And so that's why we're here, and we're happy to share that with y'all in this format. But we also have it as a blog post as well as a hard copy booklet that Josh could mail to you if you so desire your information that way, or know other folks who might want it in that way. So let us know. We can always capture that info at the end. And then additionally, I'd like to invite Catherine to introduce herself too, and sort of her role in producing this information for folks, as well as sort of generally your programs and that sort of thing, so that folks are kind of more clear.
Thanks, Amber. Hi, everybody. My name's Catherine Kavanaugh. I'm with the National Farmers Union, and I work specifically with the Local Food Safety Collaborative. So we're basically trying to help producers get up to compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. We do a lot of work with produce specifically, although this resource has expanded to include a little bit more than that. Yeah, this project kind of came about because we were wondering, specifically brainstorming with CAF what kind of projects we could do. And yeah, we realized that there really wasn't any food safety materials out there on the topic of wildfire. And while it's not something that we want people to have to necessarily utilize this information, it's good that it's there. And I really thank Amber for spearheading this project. So thanks, Amber.
My pleasure. Yeah, I basically get paid to nerd out with people who are in the know. And I should have mentioned actually that Catherine also has a podcast series that we also have recorded some info on this topic for, but I think it's still in the works. Is that right?
Yeah, but soon it'll be the next episode that we publish. So probably the next couple of weeks, the same material will be available in yet another form. So the podcast is called The Food Safety Dish. We talk a lot about food safety, all about food safety, actually, different things, different topics all the time. So you can find
Perfect pun.
it.
I love it. No excuse now. The information is in every format. Awesome. Okay, well, we will just jump in here. I will apologize in advance. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of content here, so the slides are a little bit text heavy sometimes. I will try to keep it, high level, and then I'm not super formal about things. If like something is flaring up in your mind and you want to ask that question in a moment, feel free. If I know it's going to be answered in the next slide or something, I'll pause perhaps, but otherwise we don't have to regulate ourselves to the assigned Q&A at the end, but we do also just put some time there for like a nice open roundtable discussion. All right. Any thoughts or questions before we move forward? Everybody getting settled? Snacks, tea? All right, we'll jump in. All right, so yeah, as we know, for most folks, this is not new. Wildfire disasters are obviously increasing. And a lot of growers are asking new questions. And so, yeah, we had to basically sort of pivot our program to start addressing some of these new questions. And oftentimes that means going to farms, visiting people, talking to regulators, all kinds of like little weird things that we weren't quite sure about. And I'll just say too that the reason that CAF is involved in this specifically, if you're not familiar with CAF, they've been around for 45 years, and they basically work in these four main buckets with ecological farming, policy advocacy, farm to market, and farmer services. The Wildfire Resilience Program is housed under farmer services, primarily because there is some crossover, obviously, with policy and ecological farming, but yeah, we do work closely with some of those other teammates, but felt like it should be under the farmer services because there's a lot of person-to-person relationship building that comes when there's disaster-related work to be done. And so part of the focus of that program was to identify, develop, and deliver specialized recovery and preparedness resources, but also training opportunities and emergency funding as well. So this particular resource, sort of as I mentioned, aims to really address some of the more common post-fire food safety concerns, but also like how to assess potential impacts if you're in an area that's getting, common or more frequent and intense fires, and also what kind of remediation options then might be available if you've had direct impacts. So I want to kick it off too with like just checking with the current folks on the call here, like, what's your personal experience with fire, right? Like what kind of actions have you had to take yourself, or what's the majority of your community dealing with? And so choose like your top response, because even though you might have like provided firefighting services or something, if you had fire on your land, that's obviously like kind of the more prevalent experience. So Josh is going to launch that for us. We'll give everybody a few minutes to respond. And the idea here is that we've actually asked this question in a variety of different webinars and presentations, and it's nice to kind of know like what the experience spread is of folks, and also you might be kind of surprised by like the concentration of experiences, and so that's kind of interesting too. Now I minimized the poll and I don't know where it went. Let me just double check what I can see here. Polls. There we go. Okay. I think maybe everybody has had a chance to respond. It looks like 7.
Yeah, I think we had everybody.
Cool. So I think we can share the results on the screen there. Is everybody can see that? Hopefully. If not, I can verbally report out. Are you able to see that, or are you able to share it, Josh?
I think I'm sharing. I can't see
it.
if I am though.
Okay, cool. So kind of interesting that at least half the folks here have know someone who's been impacted, and nearly half have had something direct. So I also think that it's interesting that sometimes we minimize like this idea of like prolonged smoke exposure, because we call that an indirect impact. But if you've been in a smoky situation for 20 days straight, it's nothing little, right? So kind of interesting sometimes how regulators and other folks like look at what's indirect versus direct, and how to deal with that. And it's not just us, right? As Dylan knows and other folks, it's also your livestock. So even though those are considered indirect impacts, we know that they can be very intense and severe. Thanks for participating in that. So I'm no food safety specialist, and I will just say that this was interesting to me that, as Catherine mentioned, there's this produce safety rule, and there's 3 main ways that crops are contaminated, right? So what's interesting is they only focus on the biological and chemical contamination. It doesn't really talk a lot about physical contamination, although we know that they're kind of intermixed, right? Like you can have particulates that are maybe like not necessarily only chemical based or only biologically based, but they're contributing to food safety concerns. But mostly they're looking at things like E. coli and viruses and some of the more like human health specific concerns. And yeah, I think that that's interesting only because long term we know that there's all sorts of challenging things building up in our soils over time, not just from wildfires, but lots of other types of disasters. So useful, however, to keep those things in mind if you're a producer, or that this is kind of how the national feds look at these types of things. So I would say that by and large, right, the biggest concerns are toxins and the residency time of those toxins. So obviously, with some things we know they have a longer half-life, and so they stick around in the environment longer, whether that's the water or the soil. But there's a lot of things that we use on a farm that can be toxic, right? So if they go up in flames, like you don't have a whole lot of control of where that stuff ends up. And so there are concerns about the long-term effects on agricultural irrigation sources, soil health, and all that, but it's still relatively, new research field. So of course, heavy metals is one of the other big concerns too, because that one's really hard to remove and it bioaccumulates in both animals and humans. And so, and not to be forgotten, of course, is like these other effects on things like organic certification status. For those who are organic farmers, you already know how hard it is to keep your non-organic, friends and neighbors from impacting your operation. So imagine how hard it is to control wildfire smoke and other types of impact in that same category. So yeah, POPs are the big one, heavy metals, and then nutrients. Those are sort of like the three main classes of pollutants that we're looking at. And this is like definitely the meat and potatoes of the information that we went through with this guide. And I'm not sure if folks here have done much of their own research, but I thought it was interesting that most people don't think about nutrients as a pollutant, but obviously when we have too much nitrogen and it runs off a site, right, we've got algae blooms and all kinds of other problems in downstream systems. Yeah, and those things can have other eutrophic effects like, stealing oxygen and all kinds of things from the critters that need it. So, but that is sort of like probably one of the more minimal categories that folks are concerned about. Heavy metals, this is one that is always kind of challenging because it's expensive to test for, right? Nobody really goes to this level in general when they're doing their like annual soil tests, right? Most people are looking at NPK, maybe organic matter, things like that. But if you have had a known fire in your area, you definitely want to check this out. It's true that there are background levels of certain heavy metals, like aluminum. So, the EPA sets different standards for those types of things. But yes, definitely seen some horrifying pictures of things that, folks have endured. So if you know that you've had, melted batteries and all kinds of like other types of content that might be contributing to the soil or your growing areas or your water systems, you want to have it tested if you are at all able to do so. And I know sometimes they run grants for that. So if it's like, outside your budget or whatever, that's an option at some places. So talk to CAF. I know that they've actually given those exact grants out in the past. So, but anyway, yeah, dioxin, those are some of the main big ones because they just hang around the environment so long, so bad that we know that basically every mother's breast milk has some sort of, form of a POP in it. It's really hard to avoid this stuff in the general environment, let alone in an impacted site. So it's important to have those things on your mind. So how do these things get into the areas that we don't want them, right? Well, yeah, airborne and smokeborne, right? Basically wind dispersed, uptake through plant roots, the particulates that land on the leaves themselves, and then bioaccumulation through the food chain. So, generally speaking, a lot of row crop farmers notice right away if there's a problem with their plants because you'll see some of the wilting or discoloration or things like that in an extended like heat situation or obviously with direct contact. But yeah, smoky days, right? It cuts out some of the photosynthesis that's happening and really just stresses plants, right? Those are stressful conditions. And so generally speaking, you'll start to see an obvious change. And it's good to monitor that because those are usually indications that probably you should check the soil too, right? It's not so obvious in the soil or the water sometimes. So if your plants are unhappy, that probably means some other things are unhappy. These chemical contamination pathways are a little bit different. We kind of already talked about heavy metals, but petroleum products is a big one, pesticides, and any other ag chemicals and fertilizers, of course. I like this AI generated image. FYI, I was like, what's AI going to come up with if I give it some keywords on this topic? So it's a little bit like post-apocalyptic, but I thought it was interesting because, yeah, you've basically got some upland areas that are going to like slough off and carry some things. And a lot of like the pesticides bind to the finer sediments for a really long time because of their expanded surface area. So those are types of things like if you know you have a high clay content in your soils, you're going to probably have some pollutants binding to those types of soils more than like a sandy loam or a better sort of well-drained system. And yeah, I mean, we all kind of use this term watershed anyway. So, like, kind of understanding how your property lies maybe in the pathway of other upland areas that are affected, even if you're not directly, impacted with fire on your property or with your crops. But, and then, sorry, I skipped myself. But yeah, so runoff, transport, those are important little factors to keep in mind. And of course, we always kind of like think about this in terms of human health, but this is ecosystem health too, right? I mean, sometimes fire, it's important to think about like fires can be a useful tool. Obviously, there's a lot of great prescribed burning, cultural burning taking place now, but those are really controlled. They're generally very low intensity, and more often than not, they're not really combusting anything other than like carbon. At least that's generally the intent. So for the most part, there is a like different level of smoke-borne, concerns with those types of fires. So when it burns hot and it burns in an uncontrolled fashion, you generally are going to have more release of things like the polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons and that sort of thing. Okay, I talk like a beast. So if it's too fast for anybody, let me know. Or if there's any questions, that's fine too. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Oh, I got a can. Evan, go ahead.
Okay, so I imagine a lot of you are from CAF or are growers yourselves. I probably should have introduced myself at the very beginning because what you were talking about with food safety and the produce safety role, I work for the Washington State Department of Agriculture, specifically the produce safety program as a inspector. So if anyone wants to field any questions regarding food safety or anything in that area, don't be afraid to throw them at me. And same with the people from CAF.
Awesome. Well, let me follow up with your intro, Evan, to have you had any concentration of question types? Like, do you always get questions about heavy metals, or do you always get questions about a specific like type of concern like smoke, illness?
Um, when it comes to wildfires, we deal with them mostly in Eastern Washington, and mostly air quality is a big issue, especially for workers and for us as State Department employees going out to different farms. Sometimes we're unable to reach those farms because of the air quality, and sometimes people just aren't harvesting because it's so bad out there, of course. But the questions we mostly field are regards to food safety and water quality and foodborne pathogens. So you were pretty on the money with your description earlier.
Good to know, and getting checked out across the various states. I'm kind of curious when you say the foodborne illnesses too. I mean, obviously we're not a health agency, so we're not always like looking at maybe the data on frequency of illness. But and we're going to get there, but something that folks maybe don't think about, and it was interesting because my supervisor Kaylee is a food safety specialist, is like wildfires disturb wildlife, right? And when wildlife are in your crop systems, looking for some quick food and a place to go that's safe, and so you might be having some movement through there that is contributing things like possible E. coli and that sort of thing. And then Dylan, after we get a, yeah.
Yeah, just in response to Evan, something that Amber and I have talked about in previous webinars and things like that before, but I don't know if it's gonna be now or later on in this webinar, but it'd be interesting to share if you've experienced any sort of livestock sickness in response towards those same water quality issues and air quality issues that you were talking about. If you have any experience with that, I'd love to hear about it.
We primarily handle, so produce safety rule primarily relates to produce that's consumed raw.
Mhm.
If
Yeah.
there is a farm that has livestock and also produce that's consumed raw, we will handle it. But there is also animal feed and commodities, that there's a food safety program that seems to be more in their wheelhouse than specifically the produce safety program. I have only been in this position for 2 years, so I don't have anything blaring or crazy examples, but I'd love to hear your guys' experiences too. That's why I'm actually here, to learn from you guys and be a resource to you guys in any way that I can. So
Thank you.
Cool. Oh, I love this discussion. Without burning too much time, Evan, if you just mentioned there's a different program for the like quality of animal feed that might be impacted. Is that correct?
yes, so the division and the programs are different things. So we're Washington State Department of Agriculture. We're in the food safety division, and then there's an actual food safety program. And there's produce safety, there's animal feed, commodities, handles those bigger shipments of like potatoes and onions. Animal feed specifically works with animal feed. There's pesticide management. Everyone has their own wheelhouse in their own sandbox. So I can definitely answer questions regarding food safety and produce, but I mean, I'll try my best to answer any other ones you guys have.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe if you want to put your program or the other one, if you have a link to it in the chat, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'll pull them up right now and I'll throw them in the chat.
Sweet. Thanks. Any other thoughts or questions kind of like while we're hovering in this area of the content and resource? It's definitely a can of worms when you start looking at water quality and all these different special pollutants of concern. So yeah, it's good to have some specialists here. But I worked in stormwater for 6 years, so I looked at a lot of water quality data that made me very nervous about what's happening. So yeah, I can understand that this is a big deal. All right. We will cruise on.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Hi, Jackie. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is if the farm did get, I'm a food safety auditor for a third party company. And so I never had a farm who had been burned before, but if there was a situation, what exactly should the farmer have done before planting again?
Ooh, well, yeah, it's hard to answer that because it depends. And actually, I don't know what happened. Maybe David's internet went out, but David's actually a great person to answer that question. He's both a livestock and row crop farmer and has had fire and wildfire retardant on his property and lost his organic certification because the wildfire retardant has a synthetic fertilizer basically in it. And so he was told that, anything that's like a leafy green or something like that, right? Things that like absorb really quickly and easily, you basically just have to kill it and start over. And with organic certification, obviously, sometimes it's up to 2 years more, depending on which part of your farm is hit. But yeah, if you knew you had heavy metals washing down into your row crops, there's the, EPA is really the body that sets the standard for what's allowable. And so, yeah, it's hard to say. Not many people are testing to that level, but what I've heard folks do is, for example, if you've got like zucchini, right, you remove all the stuff that might have been directly exposed, and then you allow like a fresh crop to come through for the next succession. But some folks just totally scrape it and put new topsoil and compost to help bind any, remaining pollutants. But I think the answer is it depends on your capacity to address it and at what level and kind of severity you've been impacted.
I'm still here, Amber, by the way.
Oh, good. Sorry, I don't know why my
Yeah.
screen is not showing that. Yay, David, talk about your
I-
situation.
You really covered it already. Yeah, there was no guidance for us as a farm beyond what you said. If it was directly edible, fresh, leafy green kind of produce, something you'd kale, lettuce, spinach, all that, just pull it out and then start over. And as you said, with like zucchini, pull all the existing fruit and then let it refruit. And then you could harvest that clean fruit. But our organic certifier had there was no additional guidance for us beyond that. We didn't have anything other than the synthetic fire retardant applied to the property. So we didn't have any structures that burned or other materials that were spilled due to the fire. So we didn't have to do any type of cleanup beyond just the fertilizer issue or the fire retardant issue.
Yeah, sorry, Jackie. The answer is it depends. Or the answer is test and monitor and test again.
No, this was still useful. Thank you. I also just one more question. If somebody's well got contaminated with let's see, the stuff they use for the fire to extinguish it, what they have to do?
I haven't heard of a well getting contaminated from wildfire retardant, probably for the most part just because the fertilizers don't, oh gosh, how should I say this? Unless they're like really have a longer lifespan, they're not going to necessarily like bind and then move through the soil and get into groundwater and then thus contaminate, a well. But certainly, over time, we do know that nitrates move through the soil, right? With a lot of conventional farming, that's actually a big problem is wells being contaminated in that way. And there's not a lot of ways to rehab a well, but you can, use some other filtration options and stuff on the back end that can help. And it's different if you're drinking it versus, applying it to your crops. So there are some different standards for irrigation versus drinking water. So not sure if that helps answer that.
It did. Thank you.
Anyone else? Maybe Evan has a comment on that. Calling you guys out. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I don't have any experience as well on well water, specifically groundwater being contaminated. Mostly what we're looking for is those foodborne pathogens, the E. coli. The FDA is really worried about E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, Clostridium botulinum, things of that nature. But I haven't heard anything about or wildfire retardants contaminated groundwater.
Yep, same. But hey, that may be a new thing we have to look at in the future. Fingers crossed that's not true. Okay. Well, we'll cruise on if there's not any other thoughts or questions. But yeah, this basically kind of recaps the components that we were talking about in terms of biological contamination. And I'll just say that the important part of this slide that I thought was really interesting is that we don't always think about, damaged septic tanks and, maybe you're a horse operation, you got a big pile of raw manure or like, those kinds of things, but also just the seasonal timing of wildfires, because if you get a wildfire right before a big rain, you've got a lot of problems, right? Versus if you have time to maybe like reseed and inoculate with some mushroom, that can absorb some of the petroleum or whatever your concerns might be. But this was the other point too about just, wildlife moving. Sometimes folks have to evacuate, and so they actually don't see what's happening on their property during an event like that. So if you have to leave and then come back, it's always good to like just take a walk through and check and see if you find any evidence of animals in there, for all the reasons that Evan already mentioned. So, but somewhat to your point there, Jackie, was the idea of, just in general water contamination, especially if you use surface irrigation water where it's a pond or a nearby creek or stream. Those things are going to be basically accumulating from any upland area, and especially if there's a rain after a fire. So the soil moves quickly when there's nothing to anchor it. All right. So this is kind of a fun newer section to this resource. We'd kind of done an earlier version, and one of the things that we like settled on is basically like, yeah, you can pre-assess sort of what the risk is to your crops and livestock before a fire comes. But obviously, if you've already had one, you probably know what your weak points are. But yeah, it's always good to just see what's the lay of your land, so what are some of the areas of concern. If you feel like there is a real concern, you can test. And then this applies to pre and post fire, but if you need to, you can implement some practices to protect those sensitive areas, and then monitor again, right? Basically, monitoring is never done, because that's how we know if what we're implementing is working or not. Sort of basic pest management, integrated pest management protocol 101, and then test again, because things do change over time. I'll jump into it a little later, but there's been sort of like the law of diminishing returns on certain types of practices if it's been like more than 2 years, right, after a fire. Like some types of practices might not give you very much bang for your buck. So it's good to keep that kind of stuff in mind. There are a lot of different regulations, and along with that, there's a fair amount of government assistance out there for different types of disasters. In California specifically, the Office of Emergency Services does do some debris removal programs through Cal OES, but they usually contract out, and they'll take a lot of soil off your property to make sure that no contamination is there. But then that also means that you usually have really poor soils that you have to start over with, and doesn't necessarily account for other types of movement of toxins into other areas. But also sometimes I'll just mention that folks, if you have alternative housing, like a yurt or a trailer or something like that, and you don't have the standard brick and mortar style housing, sometimes you don't qualify for these types of services. So it's a little challenging, and this is actually something that CAF looked into and ran a small emergency recovery grant fund for farmers, because we know that a lot of folks enter restrictions when they go into the government space. So it's good that if you didn't know, and maybe I can make Josh put it in the chat, CAF now has a general page for all different types of funding sources available to farmers for different needs and different reasons. So it's a database basically, and we can input the parameters of those different grant opportunities for farmers. And so, yeah, keep an eye on that if that's of use to you and folks. For the most part, I think they're California centric. So sorry, those who are not in California on the call, but sometimes they're national efforts, and you can find something similar in your region from the same program, but a different branch. And then, yeah, this is sort of just underscoring what David was sharing, is that the National Organic Program has, sets these standards for the organic transition period. So what we've learned is basically if, you have wildfire retardant drift or direct impact on your crops and your land, you kind of have to remove that in order to, start over, but also you can lose partial or full certifications. David, I'm not sure if you had an update and you wanted to share with your experience, because I think it's been about 2 years since we chatted, but was kind of curious, yeah, how that settled out for you, and if you were willing to talk about it.
Yeah, it really went nowhere. So to catch everybody else up, we had a wildfire July 1st, 2022, and Cal Fire dropped retardant on my property and adjacent properties to stop the fire from moving. And the way I'm certified with CCOF. The way they looked at it was the fire retardant is a prohibited material, and I lost my certification depending on whether it was what CCOF called a direct application versus drift. And the way they distinguished between the two was basically the flight path of the plane and the intended path of the drop of the fire retardant was the path of direct application. And we lost our certification on 2 parcels of land for 3 years, because 3 years is the I can't remember their verbiage, but that's the period of time you lose your certification. You're eligible to go to transitional organic after a year, and you have to stay transitional for 2 years, and then you can regain your certification for regain your certification in full on the 3rd year. Anything outside the path of direct application, they consider drift. And we didn't lose our certification at all on any of those areas. As we kind of discussed previously, they made us pull out certain crops that were affected and pull off the fruit from any fruiting crops like zucchini we talked about earlier. I was hopeful that CCOF would reevaluate that. And Amber, you and I talked about this a lot. There's some wording in the National Organic Program standards regarding sprays of non-organic material that are mandated by a state or federal agency. And my view was that I had no control over this. A state agency, namely CAL FIRE, dropped retardant on my property, irrespective of my operation or my wishes. And not necessarily that I would have wanted them to do anything different, because they did stop the fire, and I guess fire retardant's better than the fire burning through my property entirely. But I just felt like, well, so back to the NOSP standard, if your farm is affected by a mandated spray by a state or federal agency, you're exempted from punishment in the National Organic Program. But that rule was mostly written for treating, say exotic or invasive pests or disease, like maybe the citrus psyllid or some other pest that the state or Fed wants to treat to make sure it doesn't destroy an entire industry. And they just didn't look at fire retardant the same way. And so there was some chatter from CCOF about appealing through the state organic program. As far as I'm aware, that basically went nowhere. And so we've come to almost 2 years since the fire, and so we have to complete another year of probation, if you will, until we get our certification back on those 2 parcels of our land.
Yeah, that was heavy news from CCOF. Is one of the California certifiers for organic producers, and it's even worse for livestock. I mean, any exposed livestock, right, including products like eggs, can't be sold, labeled, or represented as organically produced except for milk or milk products produced at least 12 months after exposure, which is like a whole thing, right? So I don't know, Dylan, if this is intriguing to you as a livestock operator, but I mean, even exposed offspring of your, your standard livestock have to wait like two-thirds, let's see, what does it say? I'm reading the produce or the rule that David was referring to, section 205.672 of the NOP standards. But basically, yeah, the language is expose offspring of mammalian breeder stock in the first 2/3 of gestation is still considered organic. So there's maybe one small victory there. But yeah, this is a
Except-
complicated topic.
Unless you have chickens which don't gestate, we lost our certification on our chickens, and that was the end of the conversation on that.
Right. I
So
think
we
you
just
started over, right? You just got a new flock. Yeah. So
we
these are
just
expensive
sold- yeah.
challenges. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so as David mentioned, I mean, these exemptions already exist for things that are arguably worse than a fertilizer, a synthetic fertilizer, such as some of these hardcore insecticides that they'll spray when there's a state emergency. But yeah, so there's some interesting arguments to be made to kind of create something similar until there's a better system for supporting folks that are in that situation.
I have to say, I do recognize the picture in your slide. It's very familiar.
It's yours. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I should have put I should have had your credit there. Yep. And it was interesting. I like this photo because you show very clearly that you have some, like a tarp mulch type thing right there, right? So it's actually protecting it, and the plants took the main hit. So everything under it was actually like not directly exposed, but obviously it's still challenging to make that case for your certifier. So yeah.
Yeah, and interestingly, that picture was from an area that was affected by drift, not by direct application. So we never actually lost our certification on that particular parcel.
Amazing. Well, I didn't show the picture of your tractor that was covered in pink cake dust.
Yeah.
Yes. Any thoughts or questions? We can cruise on, but thought that. Thank you, David, for sharing that. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I haven't experienced that. Like, a lot of the producers that I'm involved with that like have been through fires are doing contract grazing, and so their main form of income is the contract grazing. Their animals aren't always moving right into market, and so I haven't actually heard of anyone getting stuck in that situation from my personal circle. But it's been more on the other end of things that fire has affected them. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, at the risk of opening a can of worms for livestock producers, I think it would be interesting, like if no one's really monitoring, right, and you have wildfire retardant suddenly on the feed where like you have a grazing operation going, like how does that affect your organic grass-fed beef, right, or whatever? And it's like, we don't really have answers to that stuff yet, unfortunately. So yeah. Okay, I think I can, next slide. So yeah, this next section is more about like livestock processing and handling, because this is another area where we definitely had to do some digging, and we know that there's definitely respiratory impacts, right, for a lot of the livestock, and that is a problem, especially for different types of livestock. Apparently, I learned this, but like poultry have a different intake, air intake system, and so actually they like don't filter as much previously so the buildup is quicker and the problems are faster with them. And also in terms of some of the ungulates or your hooved livestock, the goats tend to appear to be like a little bit more susceptible. But yeah, all types of problems were reported across all types of producers. We are working with a researcher from UC Davis that did a really great survey of ranchers in California and asked all these questions, and is actually in the process of producing a report, and hopefully it'll also get submitted to the Cal Ag magazine soon so you can see all that fun data. But yeah, there's a couple things you can do if you have options to like move the livestock to better areas with ventilation, or obviously move them far away from the fire. But we do know that there's like lower birth weights and reduced milk productivity and that sort of thing associated with these types of exposures. And it's not I'll let Dylan maybe speak to this too some more, but like it can be challenging, right? Because small grazing and ranching operations have difficulty accessing federally inspected meat processing and packing facilities anyway, because of large regulatory, issues, but also scarcity, especially in California with these brick and mortar facilities. And so some of the more local custom, butchers are already usually operating at capacity or maybe aren't cost effective. And then, that compounds those problems when you have a disaster, right? And you need to like move your animals quickly and maybe they're stressed out. And so all that kind of leads to untimely, management of the herd, and that need to transport on short notice or find those alternative grazing sites also can place additional stress. Right now they're mixing maybe with your neighbors like goats, and you guys don't know if you do the same practices in terms of insect and disease management. So yeah, do you want to talk about this a little bit, Dylan? I know this is your wheelhouse.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. The particular market that I found myself in, I think that I've actually been blessed in many ways to have quicker access, but it's still not quick access to federal processing. And with custom processing, that's just a matter of labor. I've been in this for like a little while now, and I've managed to meet or train people around me that can assist with proper slaughter and have a product that's deliverable. But yeah, I mean, like, if you need to destock quickly and you still you're not trying to take a loss on it, that is going to be a really difficult situation to deal with. Southern California is not unlike a lot of other places. The only reason I was saying that I think I found myself in a blessed place is that I often sell whole animals, and this is something that USDA processors will make room for me for more quickly than because it takes less of their schedule to move more animals, and I have a market for whole animals. But yeah, like that's something that as what we've talked about in the past, is going to be part of any sort of fire resiliency plan for a community of livestock raisers. Is obviously there's a lot that goes into creating fire resilient landscapes and having an evacuation plan and all those sorts of things. But as far as depending on how much of your fire evacuation plan has access for pasture and things like that, that's reasonable or is not going to further drive you into losses in your business and things like that, you need to have a culling plan, and also I don't sell into my business isn't structured around selling into the commercial market either. So I would be taking heavy losses if I was going to sell to any of the places that would take them at commercial prices. So I have to be able to have them slaughtered and be able to retail them to the customers I have. And so, it is important to I mean, that's part of, what we're building in Ojai is, there is a lot of people who are interested in butchery, and there's increasingly more and more people that I could rely on to not just slaughter the animal, but also slaughter in a way that would be, reasonable to pass on to a customer. And yeah, and it is that only covers a small portion of my marketing base. A part of my business is custom customers, but then a huge other part of it is the restaurants and USDA customers, and that's still not going to take care of the USDA customers that I have, which is why I'm constantly advocating for some loosening of regulations in regards to in-state sales, especially in regards to state or CDFA sales. But I know there's even things going in, being proposed for the next farm bill to even apply these things to custom slaughter houses and things like that, where you'd be able to retail to individuals and to restaurants within the state that are slaughtered at these less regulated slaughterhouses or butcher shops. And that would give a lot of resilience to these sorts of natural disasters that and like in terms of response, and not to mention all the other applications it would have for any small farmer or any sort of ecological farmer, all these sorts of incentives that people are doing and trying to find a way to make a living while doing it. So there's the applications for all that, including especially fire resiliency, are there.
I think you like covered my whole next slide for me. So yeah, I'll just kind of briefly recap. Dylan did a great job of talking about, there's some different channels and market outlets and stuff that folks should explore if they find themselves with this type of operation and challenge, just so that you can kind of maybe have some of these things lined up when the time comes. Knowing, yeah, like some other folks, that you can direct sell to. And yeah, I know that California is trying to do some cool things, innovative things like the mobile processing facilities and stuff like that. But we know they're still like in their infancy, and you still require some infrastructure, like, specifications and things like that. And something else we hadn't really talked about is like just the stability of the electrical grid, right? We know we were like, oh yeah, what about like storing your already processed stuff, right? It's like having those backups to your backups is really important. I mean, I know I've talked to some folks that were part of the campfire, and it was one of the first things they took, because they're like, yeah, that's our paycheck right there. So we had to get all the, cut and process packaged meat off the property along with the animals that were still alive, so, and find a facility for that. So yeah, knowing where you could take those products in a moment of need is important planning. So I like that mention. And I didn't mean to skip over it too much, but this other slide was really just a recap of some of the concerns, but also like we were saying, if you can't move them out, just making sure that you have fresh water really helps reduce with the lung particulate stressors, as well as this was an interesting one coming out. Some recent research is just like having low dust animal feed, apparently. So if you have power still and you can still do like some misting and whatnot, whether it's to protect your buildings or not, you could also do that on your animal feed, and apparently that also helps with those types of impacts. So, oh, okay. I think we had a Evan. Thank you. Yes, I know we're coming up towards the end of the time here. And maybe if you haven't already left, you can throw your email in the chat function. Okay, so maybe we'll cruise through. This was, as Dylan mentioned, some of the policy responses are a little bit more specific to California, just because that's where most of our work is centered currently. But yeah, helpful to maybe look into some of this stuff if it's relevant to you. And who knows, like you said, the new Farm Bill might address some of these concerns, at least partially. So fingers crossed. So there's a couple of things too that are useful to think about just in terms of mitigation. And this is just like, yeah, protecting your space. It's pretty obvious, but you can do this with your animals, right? Through targeted or prescribed grazing or beneficial fire, mechanical methods, things like that. But that also means like protecting your farm infrastructure, right? Water, electrical, and you can do that in a variety of ways. But we already kind of talked about the backups to your backups. I've seen some interesting above ground swimming pools that folks use because it's like quick, you can pump from it, easily, and as long as you kind of have it elevated, it stores almost as much as the really expensive water tanks. So sometimes there's some inexpensive ways to prepare yourself during the season. But yeah, sort of the same idea with just like keeping, designated containment areas to keep your pesticides and fertilizers and all that stuff in the non-flammable containers or areas. That's always like, if you've ever worked in a lab, you see everything is like behind a metal thing and behind another metal thing, and sort of double walled and all that to really make sure that you can contain that stuff in the event of a fire. And then there's also like, yeah, just sort of like looking at your land, and if you anticipate a big problem, you can do some like swales to capture runoff or eroded soils or contaminated particulates and things like that. And you can also plant into those areas too with some of the other grasses and things that have those phytoremediation capabilities for like pulling heavy metals and other toxins out of the soil. So as always, it's just good prior to selling or consuming your ag products to like wash them. I know it's like we don't always think about that, but that's another mitigation method. It's very tempting to always just like pick it out of the field and eat it, but wash, rinse is good. Let's see. Remediation methods. I'm on like extra fast talking now, but So there's some cool fungal remediation options. Obviously fungi are just super sci-fi, but they're they're cool. They're like the only organism, right, that possesses this enzyme capable of breaking down like the complex and resistant molecules in wood. And it's that same mechanism that allows them to be able to break down those persistent organic pollutants and other toxic chemicals in the environment, including benzene, the PACs that we mentioned, the chlorinated aromatic compounds, and the dioxins. So pretty cool. They just, yeah, are fascinating that they can use chelation to absorb heavy metal ions from the environment. But obviously, once they absorb it, you have to still do something with it, right? You don't want to like eat the mushroom that has just sequestered all that stuff. So you do have to treat it like haz waste and get it off site. What else? You can also, microbial. We all know that organic compost is great for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that it can do also is like induce the microbial breakdown of those types of pollutants too. So maybe the old adage here, like the solution to pollution is dilution, kind of is true, just in the sense that you can reduce the intensity of the pollution with that type of amendment. And then we kind of mentioned phytoremediation. That's the vegetative natural capability of certain plants to repair and regenerate toxic soils. So that's, if you ever look at those, Superfund sites, that's what they're doing. They're using phytoremediation and lots of compost. And then I like this idea too of utilizing like targeted grazing and other animals, right, to like open up the soil, because they can be quite hydrophilic after an intense fire, and just improve, root distribution and stimulate the microbes in the soil when they're fertilizing as they chew along. And so, yeah, there's a lot of good reasons to have animals on the land after, but you do have to be careful about the timing of that method. And yeah, we'll cruise on. So, oh yay, we're at the summary. I'm almost on time. Okay, so yeah, anyway, we felt like this was pretty applicable to a wide variety of folks in the ag and wildfire space. Probably you can't click on those links, but I think Josh can put them in the chat. And we have a variety of other food safety and fire resources for farmers and producers and TA providers, etc. Yeah, just wanted to open it up and just see if we missed anything. I can definitely stay on the call here to answer any questions. We are trying to capture any of these comments and questions in a little notes doc for future research or updates to the resource.
Amber, mind if I chime in on the hard copy booklets?
Oh yes, please.
Yeah, so there's a blog post version of it, but we also have, oh, it's getting blurry. Hard copy versions. Okay, you can't
Oh,
see it because of
no.
the background, but
Yeah.
we have a bunch of hard copies in English and Spanish, and we have them at the CAF headquarters. I'm happy to mail a few to any of you if you'd like. I'll drop my email into the chat below.
Yeah, especially for anyone who's working with Spanish speaking growers, that'd be great, just because we know it's we don't offer this webinar in Spanish, but luckily had the funding to be able to translate it. And so we're, yeah, excited to distribute those to groups that might need it. Thank you. Oh, I'm sure there's probably some yeah, any like new top fire safety concern coming out of the discussion, or basically kind of what you already expected you need to be thinking about. Ideas for legislation. We have the ear of CalCan, our friends over at the California Climate and Agriculture Network. They do a lot of great work to support farmers facing climate impacts, and this topic definitely falls in their wheelhouse. We've got a little work group, policy work group that looks at this sort of stuff. So if you have suggestions, let us know.
You've heard all of my ideas, so I don't know if you want me to repeat them here. I believe they're inside the resource at this point.
Yeah, we captured a few, and they're definitely on the blog post because we had a little more room in there.
Great.
Yeah. Austin, I'm curious if you're still on the call, if you wanted to talk about your region and if, you know, you're hearing something similar from folks out there, or if this is like good new stuff to share, because usually Sonoma County is ahead of the curve.
I mean, we do a lot of work for disaster preparedness and more of being in the actual scenario of a wildfire and not so much on dealing with kind of the fallout from anything like chemical or heavy metals or anything as it relates to the aftermath of the incident. It's more preparedness for the actual event. Does that kind of make sense? So, I mean, yeah, we were affected back in 2017 and 2019. My wife and I have done a range of things, from a couple acres of row crops to a whole bunch of pastured chickens, but now we mainly just run cattle. So we lease pretty close to about 1,000 acres that goes all throughout Sonoma County. But we were affected in 2017 and then again in 2020. So you know, a lot of it is just kind of what to do if you're affected, how to kind of best engage with your neighbors, find anything from pasture to trailers, everything like that to be successful if something happens. But one thing I did notice, we had pasture that was burned, that we had animals on the following year, and we had a lot of abscess form. So that was the animals rubbing on, I mean, obviously I can't prove this, but it was very prevalent. So it was, I think, them rubbing on burned everything, trunks, trees, and whatever was around in the soil, everything like that.
Wow, interesting. So yeah, that kind of goes to our slide about like observing, because like you'd been doing that for a while and that was the first time you saw that, right? So it's
Yes.
like very plausible that they're related.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you haven't seen it since,
I
or
mean,
is that
every once in a while, but not when it was so obvious throughout the herd, you know,
Yeah.
that it was just a lot of animals had it, and now it's just kind of, you know, one every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Was there something you were able to do to like help relieve the stress of that like symptom that you're observing?
I mean, oftentimes you have to, you know, pop them to alleviate. It's, you know, it's like a growth that comes up on the neck where they can like rub. Typically, it doesn't happen that often, but post fires, there is just an abundance of them everywhere.
Yeah. So some skin irritations potentially from whatever smoke inhalation, like because that's true, right? Like that your body wants to push out the toxins, and that's one way that it does that. So that's interesting. Well, we can mention that to some of the researchers we work with because I didn't really find that in the literature. So I'm glad you just shared that. We always find that there's a blind spot or two when we get down to these stories. So yeah. Okay, I think this is just our contact info for Catherine and I. If you have additional questions, we're always happy to answer that and keep building and improving the resource. And I think as we already mentioned, like if you like to get your data through the podcast because you're on the tractor or doing something else and you can 2-time it, that hopefully will be coming out through the food safety dish, which also has other fascinating topics as well. If you're like soil nerd and all that, there's some good presenters on there. Sweet, thanks y'all. Appreciate you coming here late in the day, contributing your sometimes not so emotionally exciting situations, but hopefully that tapping into that so others can learn and benefit. So much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amber.
Yay. Cool.
Thanks, Amber.
All right. Take care, y'all. We'll be in touch and let Josh know if you want stuff mailed to you. Josh can pop in his email. Okay.
Bye, Amber.
Bye, David. Take care.